Hi, I'm Davies, and welcome to Mediator Academy's roundup of mediation news from around the world. But today I am standing in front of the Oireachtas, which is the Irish Parliament, where I shall be reporting live for this week in mediation. Hi, I'm Davies, and welcome to Mediator Academy's roundup of mediation news from around the world. As always, I'll try and be illuminating, informative, and a little bit outrageous. Welcome to this week in mediation. Now, we've got a slightly different format to the show this week because I have just come from, as you know, the houses of the Oireachtas, which is the Irish Parliament, for you Philistines out there, where the new Irish Mediation Bill is being presented right now as we speak to Parliament. So we're going to cover that in the show, along with a number of other very interesting, enlightening stories from the mediation world. So let's go and meet our special guest for today. So we have talked about the Irish Mediation Bill in earlier shows of This Week in Mediation, and it's currently being presented to the Irish Parliament. Now I'm in Dublin right now, as you can see. So I wanted to find the most appropriate person who can tell us a bit more about the bill, the most respected commentator in all mediation matters in Ireland, someone who is experienced in mediation. I searched the streets of Dublin and I couldn't find anyone. So instead, we've got Sabine Walsh. Sabine, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm just kidding.
I think.
Sabine is president of the Mediators Institute of Ireland, folks. Okay. And is also a very experienced mediator, academic, commentator on mediation matters, trainer, teacher, and we are very lucky to have Sabine on the show today. Sabine, tell us what's coming up in the show.
Well, so finally we have a mediation bill in Ireland, so I will be talking you through that and pointing out some of the more interesting features, particularly from the perspective of the mediator. Then we're also going to look at some legislative developments in Turkey in relation to mediation. And we're going to look at a very innovative use of mediation and mediation skills in relation to homelessness and managing homelessness, which comes from Scotland.
Great.
So then we'll see where we go after that.
And then we'll probably round up with question of the week. I should say, actually, we had some really helpful responses to the last question of the week, which was around truth. And in this post-truth fake news era that we're in, I posed a question to our viewers about how do you manage a situation where you have two parties in a room, both equally convinced about the events that happened, but diametrically opposed memories. How do you manage those moments in a mediation? So if you want to learn a couple of really helpful strategies, then go to the comments section and read the strategies and ideas proposed by two of our viewers. So thank you to the both of you for suggesting those strategies, and we always welcome your comments and questions. Let's get stuck into the first story, which is the long-awaited mediation bill in Ireland. It hasn't been enacted yet. I had an education from Sabine earlier about when a bill becomes an act. So if you want to find out more, ask me questions in the comments box and I'll tell you. But the mediation bill is interesting because I think it's going to present some dilemmas for mediators, certainly, and also some implications for mediation more broadly. So, Sabine, tell us a bit about the bill.
Okay, well, I think the first thing to point out is just how long this bill has been incoming. It was first talked about back in 2008 when the Law Reform Commission started discussing the need for legislation in the area of alternative dispute resolution, specifically mediation. We then had the first iteration in 2010. Another draft of the bill was published in 2012, and we all thought that that was going to be in place by now, but the best laid plans don't seem to work, certainly in political circles. So we now finally, 9 years after it was first discussed, are looking at a newly published bill, so that is the equivalent of a draft law on mediation, and that is under discussion. It's been presented to our Parliament, as Alan says, today as we speak.
Okay, so what does it do? What does the bill do?
What does it do? Okay.
Key features.
Key features. So key features are it regulates some aspects of some forms of mediation in Ireland. Now, I know that sounds a little bit vague, but it regulates some of the things we all have come to associate with mediation, such as confidentiality, enforceability of agreements, the rights of the parties in mediation, some of the obligations that are on the mediator in mediation. And it generally puts a regulatory framework around particularly certain types of mediation, or mediation in certain types of cases in Ireland.
Okay, all right. And does it apply to all mediations in Ireland?
No, so I think that is one of the interesting features and perhaps the challenges of this piece of legislation is that the way it is framed at the moment is that it is applicable to civil proceedings. So those of you out there who aren't in the legal world or haven't studied law might well ask, what on earth are civil proceedings? And the short answer to that is basically anything that doesn't end up with you in jail or doesn't potentially end up with you in jail. So when we're looking at court jurisdictions, anything that doesn't come within criminal law is civil proceedings.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop here. So what mediations are included in the bill and what aren't?
Good question. So basically any disputes that can come before the civil courts, that can come before the courts, are included.
Family?
Yes, okay. Family is included, but what is excluded are a certain number of disputes, including anything relating to revenue and tax law, anything that comes within the scope of arbitration proceedings, anything that is covered by existing legislation. We have some sector-specific legislation on mediation, and very importantly, any cases that come within the auspices of existing dispute resolution mechanisms, say, for example, very importantly, the Workplace Relations Commission, which is the main forum in Ireland for workplace and employment disputes.
Okay.
So those disputes are excluded from the scope of this Act.
All right, so other than the special cases that you talked about, revenue tax and so on, workplace is excluded.
Most workplace disputes, yes.
Most workplace disputes.
Yeah, and there is a little bit of interpretation to be done on which disputes are and which are not included in the Act, and that's something we're looking to clarify.
Okay, and what about community?
Community disputes, insofar as they might become civil, a civil case, are included, but it's not specific.
Right, and things like elder mediation?
Again, it's a kind of a difficult question to answer. Yes, on the face of it, yes, but again, it needs to come within this definition of a civil dispute or civil proceedings. So we're looking to clarify exactly what cases are and aren't included.
All right, okay, so that's quite interesting. Some cases are, some cases aren't.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what are the implications for mediators?
So the implications for mediators are, number one, we're hoping that it will divert more cases to mediation, because there are now very quite detailed obligations put on lawyers, on solicitors and barristers to suggest and recommend mediation to their clients and give them information on mediation. There are increased powers given to judges to invite parties before them to resolve their dispute at mediation rather than carrying on in court.
Right.
And there is a provision whereby, in due course, the Minister for Justice can implement a system of mediation information sessions for family disputes.
Okay.
So we're hoping that it'll bring more work towards our mediators. But that is the golden side. The shadow is that at the moment in how the bill is drafted, it includes some quite onerous provisions for mediators and puts some quite onerous obligations on mediators.
Pray tell.
So when a case is referred to mediation by a court under this draft piece of legislation, there is a provision there imposing an obligation on the mediator to report back to the court. Okay? Now, this report is to contain, first of all, a statement of whether mediation proceeded or not, if it proceeded, whether it resulted in an agreement or not, and if it didn't proceed, why it didn't proceed.
Okay, so let me just...
Yeah.
So what you're saying is any court-annexed mediation...
I think I'd prefer not to use the term court-annexed mediation because that can sometimes imply that there is a mediation service associated with or integrated with a court. So what we say is...
Court-referred.
Court-referred, exactly.
Okay, so any court-referred mediation...
Yeah.
The mediator is obligated under this bill
to report back to the court.
To report back to the court that A, whether the mediation took place.
Yeah, and if it didn't, why it didn't.
If it didn't, why it didn't. If it did, what was the outcome.
Yeah.
And
if the parties, and the word used is along the lines of engaged effectively in mediation. So the mediator is being asked to assess whether the parties engaged effectively in mediation.
Whether the parties engaged effectively?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So have they got a list of criteria?
No. That is one of the difficulties. And one of the issues we're concerned about is how on earth that can be measured, that can be applied. What guidelines are there? What signifies effective engagement? Now, the reasoning behind this is that the draftsmen, the legislators, are concerned that parties don't begin to use the court's ability to refer cases to mediation as a delay mechanism or as a tactic, as a strategy.
Okay.
So that a party doesn't come into court and go, oh, judge, we'd like you to invite the other party to mediation so that they can, if you like, kick the can on the case down the road another little while, or in an attempt to maybe elicit some information from the other side. So the court wants to see a bona fides, or the legislators feel that the court wants to see a bona fides of engagement.
What is bona fides?
So engaging in good faith.
Okay.
So that parties engage in good faith and don't just use a mediation referral as a tactic.
Okay, but that's quite a subjective.
Sure.
And how do you account for mediator bias?
Exactly. So this is the issue that we've raised, along with the issue that if you take this report to its next logical step and link it with a further provision in the bill which permits the court to impose cost penalties for unreasonable refusal to go to mediation, you could find yourself in a situation where a mediator's report is used to make a claim that, say, one of the parties should be penalised for costs for not engaging effectively in the mediation or not engaging in the mediation.
Can of worms.
Yes, bit of a can of worms, particularly for the potential liability of mediators, and we're really looking at what exposure mediators might have there, and also how that is going to impact on the trust of the parties. Is a process really voluntary if parties feel that if they're seen to either not to turn up, not to agree to come to mediation, or not to engage effectively in however that may manifest itself, is it really voluntary if there is the potential for cost penalties there? If a party, say, withdraws or decides not to engage in a mediation?
I think Frank Sander made the distinction between coercion into mediation and coercion in mediation.
In mediation, yes. And I suppose we would be concerned that if this issue of a report really comes down, if that obligation is put on mediators to report around the engagement of a party in mediation, we could be looking at potentially coercion within mediation, or at the very least parties who are unhappy with the report that the mediator has given to then challenge the mediator on that.
Okay, so what's next?
What's next? Okay, so the Ireland is in a bit of a unique situation at the moment. So the government we have at the moment, the governing party is not actually in the majority. So we have a minority government at the moment. What this means for this particular piece of legislation, which is proposed by the current government, is that there is still potential for amendment.
Right.
Because the government don't hold the majority in Parliament at the moment. So once the discussion on the bill is finished today, it will go through to what's called committee stage, where a committee will be appointed to examine the bill in more detail, and amendments can then be proposed at that stage.
Okay.
And a thorough debate will then take place on various different aspects of the bill. So we, and when I say we, I mean us in the Mediators Institute, will be feeding back some of our concerns and feedback to this committee, hopefully, or we will certainly attempt to do so when that stage comes around.
Okay.
And then we'll have to wait and see what the government decides.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So it's all exciting.
It is exciting, and it's important to emphasise that this is a really fantastic move for Ireland, because it gives the mediation process a new legitimacy, particularly from the perspective of the legal profession and the legal system, in that it really integrates mediation now as part of modern dispute resolution processes that are available to people in Ireland. So, we're giving it a huge welcome. We're delighted that it's finally got over the line in terms of at least being published, and we're looking forward to helping to make it as user-friendly and as effective as we possibly can.
Super, okay. So Ireland isn't the only one going through some kind of regulatory process. We've got another I was going to say European, but they're not European.
Not quite yet. We'll see.
They'd love to be, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Tell us a bit more about what's going on in Turkey.
Okay, so in Turkey, as you quite rightly say, there's a lot of legislative activity going on in relation to mediation in different countries. In Turkey, what they have done, or are again proposing to do, it's a draft law on labour mediation, on labour law, I should say, that incorporates mediation provisions. So this new draft law on the labour courts in Turkey will make mediation mandatory as a pre-trial step before proceedings can be filed. And so this law basically applies to cases that would come within employment and workplace relations, both individual and collective. So that will include, for example, trade union disputes.
Okay. And so what about things like bullying and harassment?
So those individual cases as well. And what this draft law proposes is that mediation must be attempted before the legal papers can be filed to initiate a court case.
Okay, all right.
And if those papers aren't filed, the case will be deemed inadmissible straight off until mediation has at least been attempted.
Okay, so some workplace mediation, certainly the workplace mediations I've been involved in, where they've invited a mediator in.
Yes.
It's before
or that's right.
in conjunction with the internal formal processes. So
that's right.
It hasn't yet met that.
That's right. Yeah, it hasn't gone legal, as we would say yet. Yeah, and that may well be the case in Turkey as well. But it has been identified, obviously, that the labour court is one that is particularly snarled up in terms of caseload and cases running on for a very long period of time. So this initiative is driven or directed at resulting that caseload and trying to get more of those cases into mediation rather than them ending up in court straight away.
Okay.
And it's just interesting to contrast that, I suppose, with the draft Irish bill that excludes a lot of workplace mediation, and that, at least on the surface, still stays away from the idea of mandatory mediation.
Okay.
So again, it raises all of these questions on how voluntary is mediation really, if you're mandated to attend it beforehand.
Okay. Well, I want to move away now from the regulatory framework and get back to the roots of mediation and look at how mediation has been used. It'd be interesting, actually, thinking about the impact of a really strict regulatory process when you're trying to implement more community-based initiatives.
That's right.
Okay, so there was a case in a mediation story in a place called Wedding in Germany.
I know it well.
Where they had a group of homeless people that would gather in this residential area that had a park in the middle of this square, and they would meet and drink the night away, and the problem for the local community was they had young children that would use the park during the day, and there were broken bottles, and there was
not great.
mess, and it was and of course loud noise at night, a real problem. They had a mediation between the community members, I think the local council, and representatives of this group of homeless people, and they came up with a solution that was, on the face of it, was a real win-win. They ended up building an area that was designated for this group of people, so they could still meet and get drunk, and they put some public facilities in there, and they didn't disturb the local people. And I thought that was a lovely story.
Yeah,
There's a slightly different initiative going on up in Glasgow at the moment. Tell us about that.
In Glasgow. So what they have been doing in Glasgow is that they have been, I say that there's some of the state services, so they are mediators who are working within the social services, some as mediators, but some also as social workers or other professionals who have mediation skills. And they have been working to address homelessness in Glasgow and address it from at every stage of the cycle of homelessness. So as a preventative measure, and even where maybe somebody has become homeless, to try to reverse that and get them back into long-term accommodation. And it seems to be taking place kind of outside very formal mediation processes, so they can be, if you like, mediative interventions. But one lovely example I think that was given, which is not actually unrelated to the example you gave, was where the mediators, or the people with the mediation skills, worked, for example, with an adult child of parents who had fallen into alcoholism, as a result of which had then been forced to or had to leave the home because of the threat to the parents and that, and had become homeless. And they had worked with this person and the parents to broker, to negotiate, to mediate an agreement pursuant to which he could move back into the family home, at least temporarily, with a view then to moving on to other accommodation in due course. So that was an instance of somebody, coming out of homelessness back into permanent accommodation. Another aspect to this initiative then is mediation between, say, tenants or people living in houses who might be on the brink of losing their homes because of missed payments or whatever, and local authorities or landlords to try to prevent the family or the person or the people from becoming homeless, and try to put in place a mediated agreement so that the local authority or the landlord, will obviously get what money is due to them or whatever conditions need to be met, but the people involved can actually stay in their accommodation, so to prevent homelessness from that perspective.
And is it working?
It seems to be working. It seems to be working particularly because the mediators are seen as being independent of the local authority. So the mediators are seen as neutral, as not being there to represent the wishes of the local authority, which is hugely important, of course, because if a tenant is feeling under threat, under pressure because they're not meeting rental payments, whatever, having an impartial person, an outside person to mediate that meeting is very important. And also because these mediations happen, of course, confidentially. So these thorny issues around family relationships, around gambling, addictions, drugs, alcohol abuse, can happen in that space, safe, confidential space, without going into the public eye. And that seems to be making it safer for families and parties to find their way into that process.
So would these types of cases then be, if these were happening in Ireland under the bill, would they be subject to...
So that's a really interesting question. At the moment, potentially they could come within that framework. If, for example, if you had a dispute between, say, two siblings over the rights to a house and the rights to live in a house, that could find its way to the courts eventually. So yes, that could come within the framework of the bill. If it was a tenancy dispute, interestingly enough, it wouldn't, because there's an existing mediation process in place in Ireland under the Private Residential Tenancies Board that would address those kind of cases.
So it sounds like any regulation needs to be quite elastic then to accommodate lots of different
and this is the big challenge with regulation. Regulation of something like mediation is that, regulation is a good thing because it legitimizes a process, it puts a secure framework around it, it protects parties and mediators in many ways, particularly if, say, confidentiality is a legal requirement. But the flip side of that then is that mediation, as we know, is such a flexible process. And it's very difficult to find a one-size-fits-all regulation that will suit the needs of, say, a family mediation process where you might be working directly with children, a commercial mediation process where you might have to have lawyers and bankers and accountants involved, and then something like this, a community mediation process where there might be no written agreement to mediate, you might be meeting people in parties' houses, there can be whole teams, whole communities, groups of individuals like those homeless people in Berlin involved. So it's a real challenge for regulators to try to get that balance of creating the safe regulatory framework while preserving the flexibility which gives mediation its magic.
Oh, that's very interesting. I mean, it's been I think the theme of this show has certainly been regulation.
Yeah, and I think often people think regulation is a bit dull and boring, but actually for mediators, for us all as mediators, it is hugely important. We need to know what our obligations are and what the parties' rights are, and what the parameters are around engaging with our clients, And
also, I think from the party's perspective, to know that if you're engaging the services of a mediator, that they are trained, that they are competent, that they have standards, that they have an ethical framework to inform their practice. And you have that, because at the moment in the UK, that's...
No, I have to say on that note, the Irish Mediation Bill does not make provision for set standards.
Right.
It does permit the Minister to issue a code of practice draft and issue or adopt a code of practice that mediators then can be required to adhere to, but it doesn't set out a minimum training standard as yet.
Okay. Well, interesting. Well, we look forward to hearing more when it turns from a bill to an act.
Watch this space.
Definitely. So that's it for this week in mediation. If you enjoy the show, please tell others about the show, because we want you talking, not necessarily about the show, but about the issues that are raised in the show. We want everyone to engage in conversations and share those conversations, so that we can make little baby steps forward with some of these dilemmas and issues and topics that are important for us all. That's it for now. So it's goodbye from me, from Mediator Academy's very grand studio. And thank you to Sabine for co-hosting the show this week.
No problem.
Cheers.
Cheers.